Hello. Today I'm going to look at the Christian Impress, the long first chapter in B.B. Price's book, Medieval Thought, an Introduction. The chapter is very long, so I've subdivided it into sections for ease of recording. The first one's going to be part one, the individual. So, before I begin, let me say you're very welcome to support my channel. If you want to like it, please do so, and if you want to add a comment, that's helpful, and share it with others. And if you want to be notified of future videos, please subscribe, and if you want to provide practical support, you can do so through Patreon or PayPal. I'll give the links below. So, to the book itself. This is the first chapter of a very short book on medieval thought, which is a useful introduction to a complex subject. And the first two chapters are Price's very quick summary, even though the chapters are quite long, of the Christian background. And then in the later chapters, she gets into the details of various aspects of medieval thought. And she's divided this chapter up into four sections. The first one dealing with the medieval Christian as individual, then the Christian community, the social and religious context of Christianity, and finally Christian texts. And this video will deal with that first part. We should begin by noting the extent to which Christian ideas permeated European thinking in the Middle Ages. As individuals, Christians were both followers of Christ and a creation of the Christian God. The Christian community incorporated both Christians as social beings amongst fellow believers and the Catholic Church as the institution which formed the focus of the community. And the major texts for literate people were the Bible and the writings of the early Christians. All of these elements were multifaceted and complex, and particularly as they evolved, became intricately interwoven. In terms of the medieval Christian as an individual, four themes can be looked at: the centrality of Jesus, symbols, rituals, and relics in imitation of Christ, particularly with Martyrs and Anchorites, and the creation of God. By Christian is meant a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, acknowledged as Messiah from Aramaic, and Christ from Greek, meaning the Anointed One. The term was apparently first used by non-Christians in Antioch shortly after Jesus' death, and commonly had a derogatory connotation in the period immediately following, but by the Middle Ages was accepted by Christians and non-Christians alike as referring to the institutions, practices, and individuals which were of Christ. For Christians, Jesus was both an exemplar of how to live and a teacher of how we should live. During his lifetime, some had seen him as the leader of a social and political movement of reform, which offered a new political and religious order for the Jews, then living under Roman imperialism. These included politically active religious zealots, including one of his own disciples, and the advisors to Rome's procurator of Judea, who accused him of preventing the payment of tribute to Caesar. But Jesus was restrained in his statements, and he didn't have any worldly success. His understanding of the peaceful and loving role of the individual was only understood among a small group of close followers, and didn't attract much attention, especially among those eager for an armed Jewish revolt, who would have seen Jesus' teachings as ensuring that the strong would continue to control the weak. During his lifetime, his followers were very few in number, and grew to perhaps 3,000 or so at the first Pentecost. The movement was then confined to Judea and the Galilee. Under the immediate impact of his teachings, however, the first missionaries arose, notably the convert Paul. For them, the concept of the Christian individual was to be Christ-like, and they adopted Jesus' leadership attributes as caretaker of the marginalized and teacher of his message. In terms of symbols, rituals, and relics, nowadays we don't, or most of us don't really think of Christianity as linked to a particular geographical locale because it's a global religion. But for the early Christians, they were very conscious of its origins in Palestine, and the Christian holy sites therein had obviously a special value, and trying to regain those was one of the causes of the Crusades in the later Middle Ages, to try and wrest the Holy Land from the Muslims. But more generally, rather than specific sites, the significant events in Jesus' life were associated with symbols and relics, and the early Christians adopted rituals symbolic of events in Jesus' life, especially his death and resurrection, and of particular central importance were worship, baptism, and the Eucharist. During his lifetime, Jesus has often gone to the synagogue to worship and also to teach and heal. And for several decades, Jewish Christians, remember initially most of the Christians were Jewish Christians continued to follow this example. Gentile Christians, non-Jewish Christians, also adopted the patterns, or copied the patterns of synagogue worship, with prayer, confession of faith, reading of scripture, exposition of the text, and the closing blessing. Secondly, although Jesus never baptized others, he had himself been baptized by John the Baptist, and the early disciples adopted this practice, a ritual which acquired increasingly abstract theological meaning over time. Thirdly, we have the Eucharist, or Lord's Supper, commemorating Jesus breaking bread and drinking wine with his disciples at the Passover on the eve of his capture by the Romans, and following his words, "Do this in remembrance of me." It probably began as a weekly common meal to mark the Sabbath and the Passover, but later became a separate ritual. We should note that over time the concept of the Eucharist changed, and increasingly the sacrificial aspect was emphasized rather than the communal aspects, which seem to have been dominant initially, with the clergy coming to appropriate for themselves the status of being the only ones who actually reenacted the Lord's Supper. Apart from just being a believer amongst a society of Christians, particular emulations of Jesus' life were as a suffering martyr and a religious recluse. Inspired both by Jesus' own passion and the Old Testament heroism of the Israelites in the Maccabean Wars, Christian martyrs sought to follow in Jesus' steps. The Acts of the Martyrs were early catalogues of Christian strength and bravery in the face of extreme persecution, including imprisonment, torture, forced labor, burning, animal mauling, and so on. These accounts were highly popularized and showed Christians ready to die for their beliefs. Actual persecution came both from popular hatred of the Christians and from formal imperial edicts, notably those by Decius in roughly 250, Valerian 257 to 60, and Diocletian from roughly 303 to 305 AD. The situation changed fundamentally in the early 4th century. In 312, the imperial edict of Milan gave Christians the right to practice their religion and have direct control over their property. Then, in 330, the Emperor Constantine dedicated Constantinople in thanks to the Christian god for victories in battle, the city becoming the center of the empire and of the Christian church. From being resented because of their exclusiveness, Christians were now protected. The ideal of martyr underwent changes as a result of all this. It was now commemorated rather than practiced. In the 2nd century, the church father Tertullian had said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and now martyrs became the centers of cults, with their bones authenticated as relics. Willingness to submit oneself to torture now became a figurative intention, against spiritual or demonic threats rather than physical realities. The second particular means of imitating Christ was that followed by the Anchorites. These were recluses who withdrew from ordinary society into the wilderness, and the idea was that Jesus had withdrawn to the desert just before he began his ministry, and that in imitation of him, Christians should withdraw from society to confront evil through asceticism and meditation. One of the main leaders here was the man we now call St. Anthony the Great, an Egyptian monk. And from his Nile village, he noted the sad state of society as symptomatic of radical disease. The rich were preoccupied with their devotion to the delights of luxury, the poor with their state of suppression and loss of contact with the goodness of God. Humans had lost sight of God. Jewish, Roman, and Hellenistic societies had all failed to acknowledge the social and religious guidance of Jesus. In response, devout Christians had to escape all worldly attachments and corruptions so as to rediscover the freshness and purity of the soul. By living in isolation, prolonged fasting, and other activities, such as some of them sitting atop pillars or living in the caves of hyenas, they sought this purity. Soon admired as holy men by ordinary Christians, the devout or the curious gravitated towards them. Some of the men, like Antony, retreating even further into the wilderness, whilst others, like Pachomius, established communities in which all members could pursue asceticism. And in the long run, that proved to be the way of the future, the era of the individual hermetic soon fading away, although lone isolates still appeared from time to time, notably in the West with St. Francis of Assisi, who's illustrated there from a Benedictine monastery from the 13th century. Finally, we have the acknowledgement that human beings are a creation of God. Religions which believe in a higher being usually have a concept of creation. For Christians, there was a relationship to God as Father of Jesus, the Son of God. God was creator of the natural world, including humans. Textual basis for the medieval discussion of creation relied on the Bible and on Plato's Timaeus. The Latin translation of the Christian Bible, including the Old Testament, was completed by Jerome in 420. This included the Genesis account, in which God made human beings in his own image on the sixth day of creation. But this was followed by the fall. After Adam and Eve, God's most prized creations, acted independently of God's will and ate of the fruit of knowledge. They were then banished from the Garden of Eden for a life of suffering. Creation was a particularized and individual act. In the 4th century, Augustine, a prominent bishop, developed these ideas theologically. Humankind was far from God, but brought near through God's grace and by the sacrifice of Jesus as his Son. Humans could never elevate themselves to this divine status. By the 12th and 13th centuries, however, Christian thinkers were beginning to develop new ideas, incorporating the ideas of pagan philosophers into their thinking, and so beginning to observe human creativity more closely. In this, they were particularly influenced by the late 4th century writer Macrobius, who directly compared God's handiwork to the human artist, and so to formulate a rival tradition whereby human creativity could be compared to that of God's. This coincided with a renewed interest in the Timaeus and Plato's concept of the creator as a modeler. Endowed with reason and wisdom as the pinnacle of God's creation, human beings were themselves able to invent, design, and create. For example, poets created with language. There was an emerging conscious recognition of the distinctiveness of each human individual, and in the 12th century, genuinely autobiographical works appeared such as Peter Abelard's The History of My Calamities in 1132 or thereabouts. Architects and sculpturers also began to sign their works for the first time. There was a new self-conscious individuality and an intellectual valuing of the artist and craftsman. Oh, by the way, here we have a 14th century image of the philosopher Abelard with his wife Eloise. A very controversial and interesting story, which maybe I'll talk about another time. Anyway, thank you to my patrons, and thank you very much for listening to my video, and have a good day.